So we've got an escalation in the nationwide challenge to the National Firearms Act, or the NFA. The DOJ is now trying to submit new evidence, and the plaintiffs are asking the court to block that new evidence. Now, this is not just a minor filing dispute over some minor issues. It goes directly to the heart of the government's taxing power defense of the NFA and could also undermine the DOJ's entire position in this lawsuit on why the NFA still needs to remain in place even after the $0 tax. So let's break down what is going on in this critical case. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. You can also click the like button if you're watching this content, and if you enjoy this type of two-way information, click that like button. That just tells the YouTube algorithm that you appreciate this content and it shares it to more people. I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is First Form. You guys know that First Form's an amazing company. They support the channel and the Second Amendment effort here on the channel, but also they have amazing supplements. And so if you're trying to get healthier, if maybe you're on a New Year's resolution and you're trying to get healthier like me, I've already lost 15 plus pounds since the beginning of this year. I use a lot of their supplements, a lot of their protein powder. So if you're interested, if you're kind of on that same journey, check them out using the link down below. And if you order any supplements, you can get a free 5-pack of protein sticks. Now, as you know, Congress passed H.R. 1, the One Big Beautiful Bill, and inside that bill, the whole making and transfer tax on suppressors, SBRs, SBSs, and AOWs was reduced from $200 all the way to $0, and that's currently in effect. Now, historically, the Supreme Court upheld the NFA as a valid exercise of Congress's taxing powers. So that is also critical for what is going on in these current lawsuits. The entire constitutional justification for the NFA rested on taxation. So once the tax was eliminated, multiple two-way organizations filed lawsuits, and they argued that there is no longer a tax on these items. And because of that, there is no longer a taxing power basis for the NFA. And that's what's at the heart of the case that we're going to be talking about, Jensen versus the ATF. The plaintiffs are asking for the court to declare that the NFA's registration and transfer requirements for the now untaxed firearms exceeds Congress's enumerated powers. In this case, both sides, the ATF and the plaintiffs, are asking for cross motions for summary judgment. The plaintiffs want the court to rule now without a trial that the NFA's restrictions on suppressors and SBRs and AOWs and all these other items is in fact unconstitutional. The DOJ wants the court to uphold the NFA in full. Now, in its original brief, the DOJ made three major arguments. They argue that the NFA is still supported by the taxing power because of the special occupational tax, the SOT tax on manufacturers and dealers, and they argue that that still exists. They also argue that even if the whole taxing power argument fails, the NFA is still valid under the Commerce Clause, and they said that even if unconstitutional in some of its applications, the ruling cannot apply nationwide and can only apply to these specific plaintiffs. Now, in this case, the plaintiffs have fired back against the ATF, and there were some new filings that came out in this case, pushing back against some evidence that was submitted improperly by the ATF. On the day that the DOJ's reply brief was due, the DOJ also filed a motion for leave to submit a second declaration from the ATF's NFA division chief. The plaintiffs immediately objected to that and argued that the court should not allow that in. So the question is, why are they doing this? Well, because under the Northern District of Texas rules, reply briefs are meant to rebut arguments, not introduce new evidence. And the local rules specifically prohibit filing supplemental evidence without first getting court permission. The plaintiffs argue that the DOJ is essentially attempting to cure a weakness in their case after seeing the plaintiffs' counter-arguments and what they said in their briefs. The plaintiffs argue that the DOJ is submitting this new evidence to try to bolster their argument that the SOT tax is good enough to keep the remaining NFA restrictions in place. So in that new piece of evidence, the ATF argued that in 2025, the ATF disapproved 691 applications due to SOT-related issues. So the DOJ is using this and this type of argument that the NFA's registration system still helps to enforce the SOT tax. But the plaintiffs are pushing back against that very hard. They argue that the government already had the opportunity to provide specifics earlier in this case, especially on this very issue. And they also argue that 691 applications is less than 1%. It's actually just 0.14% of the 478,709 approved NFA transfer applications that happened in 2025. And they also point out that this new piece of evidence that was submitted by the ATF through this declaration does not specify what those SOT issues actually were and why they were denied. So in other words, the government is pointing to a minuscule fraction of cases and calling that proof that the entire registration regime is still necessary and should remain in place. The plaintiffs characterized the DOJ's move as a classic second bite at the apple. So they saw how weak their arguments were, they saw the replies from the plaintiffs, and now they're trying to cure up their case by adding additional evidence, potentially trying to do it in an improper way. They point out that the DOJ already filed one declaration from this ATF chief. The plaintiffs rebutted that, and now the DOJ wants to add new specifics only after seeing that rebuttal and seeing how weak their case actually was. The plaintiffs argue that this deprives them of a meaningful opportunity to respond, and they say that if the court allows this new declaration in, they should at least be allowed the opportunity to file a short reply brief. So this is now a procedural fight kind of layered on top of the constitutional battle that's also going on in this case. So here's kind of what this tells us about the current DOJ position on the NFA. The fact that the DOJ is scrambling to add more SOT data tells us something very significant. The $0 tax argument is hitting home with them, and if the SOT enforcement theory were clearly sufficient on its own, they would likely not need to add additional declarations to shore up those arguments. This shows that the taxing power defense is the most vulnerable part of this case, and the ATF is now scrambling to protect that argument. Now, here's what we need to be watching for going forward in this case. Essentially, first, we need to see, will Judge Matthew Kaczmarek, who is the judge in charge of this case, will he allow the new declaration in? And if he denies that leave, the government's SOT evidence will remain very thin, and it's probably one of the weakest portions of these arguments. If he allows this new evidence in, well, the plaintiffs will likely get to respond to that and get to point out some of these statistical weaknesses with that new piece of evidence and try to undercut that DOJ theory. Now, the second big thing really comes to the merits of the arguments. The taxing power argument really now is the pressure point for this case. If the court finds that the NFA is no longer genuinely tied to revenue collection, that opens the door to serious constitutional consequences for this case and could potentially undermine the entire NFA. So this case is evolving in real time. What began kind of as a straightforward constitutional challenge is now essentially exposing the fragility of the NFA's taxation, foundation here. The DOJ's reliance on that tiny enforcement fraction is also being exposed. And, there's a lot of procedural tensions going on with this case right now because the ATF is trying to protect this case and keep it alive. If the court finds that the NFA's registration regime is not meaningfully connected to tax enforcement, well, then essentially that destabilizes the core structure of the NFA, and that would be a big win for everyone nationwide. But ultimately, no matter what, I think that this case will eventually find its way to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. So that's what's currently going on in this critical case, Jensen versus the ATF. The DOJ is trying to kind of shore up its taxing power defense with this new piece of evidence. The plaintiffs are pushing back against that very hard, and the court now has to decide both a procedural and constitutional question that could essentially reshape the NFA in this type of litigation nationwide. So as we get more information, as it develops more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content and it should share it to more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.